In the bustling heart of Paris, where the Seine weaved its poetic paths and the Eiffel Tower stood as a sentinel of romance, Isabelle Dubois was an artist struggling to find her muse. Her days were spent sketching the same cobblestone streets and the same wistful faces of tourists, but her heart yearned for a story she could bring to life. Little did she know, that story would walk right into her favorite cafe on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The bell above the door jingled, and a gust of wind carried in a man who seemed both lost and perfectly placed. He was tall, with an unruly mess of chestnut hair and eyes that mirrored the stormy skies outside. He was the kind of man who belonged to a different era, with his tailored trench coat and a book tucked under his arm. He looked around, his gaze lingering on the faded posters of jazz concerts adorning the cafe walls, before settling at a corner table. Isabelle, sitting near the window, couldn't look away. She had sketched countless faces in her career, but his was different, timeless, as if he'd stepped out of one of her unfinished canvases. On impulse, she began sketching him, her pencil capturing the way his brow furrowed when he read and the subtle curve of his lips as he sipped his coffee. Their worlds collided when he caught her staring. "I hope I don't look that peculiar," he said with a smile that made her cheeks flush. "Not peculiar," Isabelle replied, flustered. "Just interesting." "Interesting is better than peculiar," he said, standing and walking over to her table. "May I?" Before she could respond, he sat down, placing his book on the table. The cover read Le Temps Perdu by Marcel Proust. "I'm Julien," he said, extending a hand. "Isabelle," she replied, shaking it. His touch was warm, grounding her in a moment that felt surreal. Over the next weeks, Julien and Isabelle became inseparable. They wandered through Paris, trading stories and dreams. Isabelle learned that Julien was a historian researching the mysterious disappearance of a famed 19th century poet, René Valmont. Julien's passion for the past fascinated her, and she found herself inspired in ways she hadn't been in years. But there was an air of mystery around him, a sense that Julien didn't entirely belong to the present. He avoided questions about his family and never carried a phone. His stories of the past were so vivid, it was as if he'd lived them himself. Isabelle dismissed it as eccentricity until the night she followed him. It was late, and Julien had left their dinner abruptly, saying he needed to check something at the library. Isabelle, curious and concerned, decided to follow. She trailed him through the quiet streets, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. At the library, she watched as Julien pulled an ancient key from his pocket and unlocked a door she'd never noticed before. The door creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. Isabelle hesitated, but her curiosity won. She slipped in behind him, careful to keep her distance. The staircase led to a cavernous room filled with shelves of dusty books and artifacts. In the center stood a clock, its face glowing faintly. Julien approached it with reverence, placing his hand on its surface. The room shimmered, and in a blink, he was gone. Isabelle gasped, stepping closer. The clock began to glow brighter, pulling her in. Before she could resist, she felt herself being transported. When the world settled, Isabelle found herself in 1847 Paris. The city was both familiar and alien, its streets filled with horse-drawn carriages and gaslit lamps. Julien was there, speaking with a man who could only be René Valmont. Isabelle's presence startled them. "Isabelle, what are you doing here?" Julien's voice was a mix of panic and relief. "I could ask you the same," she replied. "What is this?" Julien sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm a time traveler, Isabelle. My mission is to preserve history by ensuring key figures like René fulfill their destinies." "And you couldn't tell me?" Isabelle's voice cracked with hurt. "I wanted to protect you. This world isn't safe for those who don't belong to it." Despite her anger, Isabelle couldn't abandon Julien. She became part of his mission, using her artistic skills to blend into the 19th century. Together, they ensured René completed his masterpiece before his untimely death, a poem that would inspire generations. But as their bond deepened, so did the inevitability of their separation. Julien belonged to no time, forever moving between eras. Isabelle, tethered to her own timeline, knew their love was fleeting. On their final night together, Julien took her to a quiet spot overlooking the Seine. "If I could choose a time to stay in, it would be with you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But you can't," Isabelle whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, and you can't stay here." Julien kissed her, pouring a lifetime of love into a single moment. "You have to go back and live your life. Paint your story." The clock struck midnight, and Julien activated the device that would return her to the present. Isabelle reached for him as the world dissolved, but he was already gone. Back in modern Paris, Isabelle channeled her grief into her art. Her paintings, filled with emotion and mystery, captivated audiences worldwide. She never saw Julien again, but in her heart, he was always there, a love eternal, caught between two worlds. And every rainy Tuesday, she'd visit the cafe, hoping that the bell above the door would jingle and he'd walk in again.